How are you? You're good to go. I am triple checking it. Okay. We are live. Yes. All right. We're ready to go.
Alrighty. Oops. Shoot. Alrighty. So I am happy to introduce Lance Olsen. Lance Olsen. Oh, and I'm Julia, by the way. Lance Olsen is the author of more than 30 books of and about innovative writing practices, including the most recent novel, Absolute Away, which was published in 2024. Recently as well, Always Crashing in the Same Car, a novel about David Bowie, 2023. His short stories, essays, and reviews have appeared in hundreds of journals and anthologies. He is a recipient of various awards, including the Guggenheim, Berlin Prize, D.A.A.D, Artist in Residency, Rockefeller Foundation Center, lots of awards. Also, he is the recipient of a Pushcart Prize, as well as being a Fulbright Scholar. He's a professor of experimental narrative theory and practice at the University of Utah currently. And also, thank you so much for coming in and having a chat with us.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Thank you so much. Looking forward to reading a little bit to you and then just chatting about whatever you guys want to talk about. So I'm going to read a little bit from Absolute Away for like, 7 minutes, and then we'll open things up. So let's see how to frame this. The best thing to say is, so on August 11th, 1956, at about 10:15 in the evening, Jackson Pollock drove his car off the road in Long Island, and he died. And then somebody else, there were 2 other people in the car, Ruth Kligman, with whom he was having an affair at the time while his wife was over in Paris. The wife's name was Lee Krasner, right? And she survived. And then there was a woman in the back of the car who died, and her name was Edie Metzger. And this is really, to me, like really, really interesting. So Edie Metzger was German Jewish, grew up in Berlin as the Nazis came to power. And one evening, her parents, who were progressives, took her as like about a 2-year-old, 3-year-old to a Nazi rally so that she could see what democracy looked like as it collapsed. And at that rally, Hermann Göring mistook her for a little Aryan girl. She had these incredible blue eyes and picked her up to kiss her. And she bit Göring on the lip so hard that it bled. And so like, she's a hero, right? Then she like totally disappears from the record. And then she turns up in the back of Jackson Pollock's car on the last night. There's so many gaps in how this happened, why it happened, and so on, that what could you do except write a novel about it? And so we can talk a little bit about that. It's to me, just like fascinating. So what I'm going to do is to read a little bit from the Pollock section. And this is through, Edie's mind, her consciousness. And it goes like this. No, that's not it. That's not how it happens. It's because I'm here, have been for years, in the backseat of this Oldsmobile 88, top down, wind enraged, tearing along some country road at night. Jackson drunk at the wheel, Ruthie by his... The world, all quick, nervous giggles. The world like leaves spinning in a crazy autumn gust. Only it's not autumn. No, it's what? It's August. Where did the summer? Nearly 10 o'clock. Yes, warm, damp air crammed with overripe foliage, faint sea rot. Except here won't fit into time. Ruthie going, slow down, Jackson, honey, slow down. How the skin goes away so quickly. We becoming obsolete from the inside out. I'm thinking, please give me more than this night. As I rise, stand shakily, gripping the back of the front seat for balance, my mouth opening, a voice I recognize as my own chanting, stop the car, let me out. Stop the car, let me out. Yet he doesn't even slow down, just flicks the headlights off, flicks the headlights on, interested to see what will... And behind my voice, Ruthie's, her hair deranged in the wind. Shut up, shut up, shut up and sit the fuck down. You're making everything worse. Her words impelling Jackson to push the car faster along a straight stretch of deserted road unfolding before us. Lights on, lights off. Don't do this, honey. Please, don't. Please, Ruthie saying, only he's already deserted us, leaning forward into the speed, shoulders hunched against trying to lift off the runway into another, more breathtaking realm. Eyes all at once wide open, shocked to watch the me of me trying to climb over the side of the car, the velocity storm trying to push me back down, and the straightaway falling behind us, the road curving left, concrete to asphalt, the wump, the car bottoming hard, jumping the crown, the sharp shove right, the me of me thrown sideways across the back seat, tires catching soft shoulder in an outburst of gravel and dirt, and Jackson yanking the wheel too hard, overcompensating, the Oldsmobile lunging into brush, swerving on and off the edge of the 100 feet, 150, trees flinging past. And then how did Jackson just lets go, the car careening off the, plunging through underbrush, left fender wrenching two young elms, and we shooting backward through scrub and trees down a slope in a dark charge, the ripping, this scraping, this crackling, this whoosh, the precipitous jolt. And we, what are we? We are airborne. Yes, that's the battleship flipping end over end, and Jackson, he's learning to fly. Ruthie learning to fly, me seizing at the seat gone, scrabbling for hold, the thought firing through my mind, no feeling is the last feeling. And then all of a sudden, it is, which is when someone turns the sound down on my life, the night strobing around us, the Oldsmobile flipping slower and slower through the relaxing to a halt in midair, and incredibly starting slowly to flip in the opposite direction, up the hill, Ruthie dropping back into her seat, screaming in reverse, Jackson landing behind the wheel, weightlessness unmade, the car gushing out of trees, off the shoulder, regaining the road, the shoulder, the road, and my eyes are closed again because of this spectacular night air, this realization building in around me that we are finally on our way to the farmhouse, just like Ruthie promised, except behind my eyelids, there's Jackson gliding 3 yards off the ground, head first, a human projectile, 50 feet in less than a second, fully aware, inquisitive, beguiled, astonished at the trees shooting toward him, his skull bursting in black-red spray. We all die at just the right time, except those of us who don't. And with that, coming to consciousness among the sweetness of mulch and leaves, the atrocity in my lower torso, so shattering I'm convinced my spine is broken, the me of us delicately reaching up to check my face, determine how much of it is still intact, because I can no longer see. I'm leaking everywhere. The awareness reaching me that here is dense woods, an incline, an exquisite light illuminating the scene through a cloud of dust from the car, its headlights resting on its side, windshield smashed, passenger door swung wide, limp like a broken steel wing, time returning in increments in the form of the Oldsmobile's jammed horn, a siren up the road, and it's just this little girl kneeling beside me, dressed in a pink bunny suit, hands curled paws to her chest, asking, "Do you believe in God, lady?" "Of course I do," you saying, "Yes, yes." "Well," the little girl saying, "You can stop now." Thanks. So do I get to join you over here now? Awesome. Right.
Yes, awesome. So I recognize that excerpt from like the second half of the novel. So Absolute Away is arranged in like 3 parts. So the first part is it's like there's some subheadings there and it's sort of fragmented. So the first part of Absolute Away, we're in like little Eddie's perspective when she's about 3 years old, and her parents take her to this book burning. And this is like where the part where like this little girl bites Goering's like lip, and it's amazing and deserved. And then we get like little forwards in time of what happens to these characters. We see like snippets of these like Nazi figures and their futures and their dooms. And then we flash back to this little girl. But I recognize that section from the second half where that's Eddie grown up, and she's like, you know, the friend of Ruth Kligman. And I was so curious of, so I was doing some research on this, and so many of these articles. So like Kligman was one of the lovers of Jackson Pollock. And there was a whole dispute with like Pollock's actual wife because she wasn't like super cool with this. But I was so curious, all of these articles, like Metzger is this little footnote. She has like maybe like one line in like the Variety article I read, a couple articles. She's a footnote of these 2 like larger than life Jackson Pollock and like, you know, Kligman is, I think they called her like the big game hunter. She had a thing of artists. She liked those men. And I was curious of like, why her? She's a footnote in every other story. Is that why she's the star in here?
Yeah, that's precisely right. So this all started when actually one day I was in MoMA and I was, do you know this feeling that you get when you can look at a painting a billion times and then one day you finally see it? So I was in MoMA in front of Autumn Rhythm, which is one of Jackson Pollock's like famous works. And everybody knows what a Jackson Pollock looks like with the action painting and all that. So I was standing in front of it, and I grew up in northern New Jersey, and my misspent youth was kind of up in the village and going to the museums and stuff. So I'd seen this painting like 8 billion times, but this was the first time I saw it. And I thought to myself, and this is how novels develop for me, like what would an action painting look like on the page? Like, how would that feel? How do you write an action painting? And that got me interested in Pollock again. And that got me interested in some really fat biographies. And it was in those that I came across this little mention, like literally a paragraph maybe this big, on Edith, this woman. She kept being described in a lot of these articles as the woman who was in the back of the car. And like sometimes not even given a name, right? And then when she is given a name, it's like the only thing you know about her historically is that she bit Goring's lip. Like that is so interesting, right? So of course I'm not going to write about Jackson Pollock. I'm going to be like, tell me something about Edie. And so I started doing research because you would think, right, you could find stuff. There's almost nothing out there. And that was really interesting to me. So as you were saying, the novel's kind of written in three parts. It's kind of a triptych. And so the first one is Edie very young. The second part is from what is around what I just read, the night of Edie's death. And then the third part are a number of lives that Edie might have lived had she continued to live, and in different genders, at different ages, always in this kind of general New York area. And so, okay, so that leads me to a second point about all this is one of the things I'm really interested about in my fiction is the past as a kind of problem. A lot of times, how to say this? Truth recovery is impossible, right? And real truth recovery is impossible. So think of somebody like Edie and think of what can we say that is true about Edie? And you realize that most of the stuff that you want to say or you want to find out is the stuff that we can't get back to. There just aren't records. Like history only exists as records, right? And so if you can't get back to the records, what do you do? And so one of the things I'm often interested in, whether it was the David Bowie novel that you mentioned, or I wrote a novel on Friedrich Nietzsche, is the inability to get back to the past, the parts of the past we can't access. And those are the parts that fiction writers can do in ways that, let's say, historians can't, because we can imagine consciousnesses, we can, visit and become empathetic with characters, fill in gaps, use all five senses in ways that can create worlds and imagine, almost like thought experiments about what it might have been like. And Edie's just one of those people that breaks your heart. Like, can you, just this idea, little girl dies one night, that's her historical record. That's amazing to me. So that's a very long-winded answer, and I will give many more long-winded answers as the hour goes on.
No, that's excellent. I'll take all the one you got. And your note about like the past being looked at as a problem, I think that's really interesting, considering like some of the subheadings in like especially the first section and then like the third section. I had a few of my favorites, but one of them was like history as forceps, and like history and like being born in like this traumatic just the world as it is. Like I think that's super interesting, and I was wondering of like how these like subheadings were like conjured in the first place. Were they like attached to text, or like did they come after, or was it sort of a mix? Like they do work to kind of like control some of the chaos, but like I'm curious of like how these came about.
Yeah, and I adore titles, and so some people who write think of titles as simply like demarcations, right? But I've always thought of titles as like little prose poems that tell you something. So some of my favorite titles are things like Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, right? David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. They're just like so resonant and not necessarily having one-to-one correspondences with the text that follows them, but are connotative of a mood, connotative of an idea, that sort of. So history as forceps is beautiful as an idea because it's very elusive. You're not quite sure, but forceps, so there's something, potentially violent about it, dangerous, weird. History is that. What does that mean? And so I really wanted to create titles that were suggestively indirect, and as any good poem would be, that allows us to fill in gaps in interesting ways.
Yeah, for sure. Like I noticed like these titles were doing like a lot of different things. Like sure, they're like demarcations of like either progression in time or like in the third section, it's more like when like these different lives are like explored, the subheadings sort of, give us indication that that's happening. But in the first section, like there are a lot of like these titles are both like omens, sometimes they're advice, like they're like statements. Like how the philosopher proves the philosopher exists. Like so many, like they're doing like so many like different things, and they're almost like part of the text itself. Like it could be the first line of that paragraph, but it's formatted in the style of a title. So actually, on that note, I was wondering like when do you choose to repeat some of those subheadings? Like, for example, how the philosopher proves the philosopher exists. There's that subheading, and then right under it, it's like that, but like two. I was sort of wondering about that choice because it's like very sequential. So I'm like, why wasn't it just like the same? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this takes us back to Autumn Rhythm and Pollock and what would Pollock look like, right? What would an action painting look like on the page? So Pollock set himself a kind of problem. And okay, I'm going to digress for 30 seconds and we'll get back to the end of that sentence. And so one of the things that makes it possible for me to wake up and work every morning on a text is to have a big enough problem that I can keep working at it for 2 years, right? That's kind of like the length, 2.5 years to write a novel. And there's nothing drearier than getting up in the morning and like having no problem. So I'm always like, okay, so what's going to get me up? Well, it turns out of all things, Pollock also did a little bit of that, and he loved jazz. And so the response to the question he asked himself, which is, what would jazz look like on a canvas, was action painting. And then I thought, oh, how cool is that? So what would action painting look like on a page? Well, both of those things, if you think of action painting as a kind of metaphor, it's a beautiful metaphor for musicality, for energy, for a kind of life force on the canvas, but also it looks incredibly chaotic and jumbled up and so on. And that was his sense of jazz. So one of the ways I wanted to play around with structuring novels was not structure them, where you have a beginning, a muddle, and an end, which is sort of what we've been taught, but rather how do you disrupt that in an interesting way, both for the reader and for the writer. And it was to try to deploy like musical motifs that both echoed like visually action painting, but also echoed moves in jazz. And you know how jazz will set up a riff and bless you, and then play off of that riff, right? And begin to improvise off of the riff. And so a lot of these titles, but also a lot of lines in the novel come back in different forms. A lot of the images come back in different forms in ways that, if you're sort of tuned into this, become either visually or sonically musical in to me interesting ways, right? As I'm writing it, and so that's another long-winded answer.
I think that's really helpful to understanding because, like, jazz is famous for being like riff. And, but also even with riffing, like things come back and to create like a coherent rhythm. And I noticed that in the text of like, for example, like the faith melting game or the cockroach game of like headings that are similar, but like changed. And then like within the text itself, there are lines that are repeated, but like in, different contexts or something like that. So like it's both, a lot of different elements being introduced, but then there are like echoes of what you've seen before.
And beautiful. One of the great, we were just at the Village Vanguard last night listening to some jazz. And one of the great things is that dissonance that you don't see coming, right? So you're sort of writing the notes this way, and then somebody will come in with a completely different sort of sound that sounds like it's just out in left field, and then magically it will come in and harmonize in some strange way for a moment, and then go out. How do you do that in a novel? Like, that is so interesting to me. And again, you know, what would that sound like in a novel? And so back to the titles again. So a lot of times those titles are, how to say this, there's a kind of dissonance between title and text. There's not a correspondence, right? The title isn't like illuminating the text. The title is trying to create a dissonance with the text, and through that dissonance opens up other possibilities. That is a really alluring move to me, because for me, the more texture you can enter into a novel, into prose, the richer the reading experience becomes. And I think we all, I think this is true, at least it's true for me, we all want to, you know, write novels that we would enjoy reading, rather than some audience out there that we don't actually know. And so the sort of voices behind, there are a lot of sentences in, let me try that again. There are a lot of other people's sentences in my sentences. There is a lot of other sounds and sonic architecture in my sentences. So one of the things that Robert and I share is a deep and abiding love for Beckett, because to read a Beckettian sentence is to understand that he's reinventing what a sentence is. Barthelme, I don't know if you guys know Donald Barthelme's work, but he always used to talk about creating these backbroke sentences. And what he meant by that was just sentences that you expect to move from here to here to here, but really they move from here to here to up there. And there's something that's just like magnificently surprising. Nabokov, who, do you know this about Vladimir Nabokov? It was so cool. When he was writing Lolita, he would take a stack of index cards, and each sentence would get its own index card, and he would work and rework the sentence until he got it perfect. And then he would line up the index cards to create paragraphs. And so every sentence was like this musical, you know, stunning extravaganza. And so you can like learn everything you ever need to know about writing by reading Lolita. It's just like, it's amazing. Martin Amis said that, you know, there should be a surprise in every sentence. Like, every sentence should not move. You know, if you wanted to write clean sentences, you should be a journalist. If you want to write complicated sentences, you should become a writer. And says Martin Amis and Olsen. And I love that idea of like, what is it that's surprising about this sentence? Is it the verb? Is it how an adjective is deployed? Is it about a rhythm that is an unexpected rhythm? Is it a move like Bartholomew that you know suddenly takes a right-hand turn in the sentence? But why? Like, why did you write that sentence? And then, you know, I think of punctuation as kind of musical notation, and so like, why, you know, Oscar Wilde has that great entry in his journal, spent all morning putting a comma in, spent all afternoon taking it out. It's that kind of precision that is just an incredible delight for me. And so that's the musicality that goes on in the sentences.
Yeah, no, I could definitely like hear that. And like for me as a writer, like that's like part of the fun. It's like sort of going to the gym and pumping iron. Like, I don't go to the gym, but I imagine sweat might be what that is. People have told me stories. But just like finding like the musicality that you want, your collection of like short, long sentences, the verbs, and like it's not the most efficient way to put a lot of words together, but then, you know, what you have is like it's really strong, hopefully. I was curious, like, so Jackson Pollock seemed to be like the impetus for this piece, but like he only lives in the middle for the most part. Like, he echoes a bit in the back. And then, you know, on reread, you see how like the imagery of his work kind of filters in with like our starting image of like book burnings and red and blood and splatter and violence. So like on a reread, you see how he sort of like, stumbles into the beginning. But I was curious of like how one like starts off a novel of this nature, because like the Jackson Pollock is the impetus, but he doesn't want it. You don't want him to take over, and he totally doesn't. But like when you're starting this piece, like was it just like trying to imagine, Eddie Misker as a child and like just paragraphs of that, or just how do you start the process of something so like experimental, especially when there's not a lot of like info on this person?
Yeah, and that is where the delight is, right? So I was lucky enough to get to live in Berlin for a year and a half, and one of the things that's so dramatically different between German culture and American culture is we have here, a tremendously difficult time coming to terms with our forensic landscape, right? The basically a country that has been built on various kinds of murder. And what's really interesting about the Germans is that after World War II, they had sort of two ways to deal with World War II. One was to repress it and forget it, and the other was to spend the rest of eternity trying to understand what had happened. And they decided to go with the latter, and it's been sort of a magnificent, torturous, emotionally wrenching process. But for instance, just to give you an example of how they do this, so they wanted to memorialize, the victims in the concentration camps, and they created these things called Stolpersteine, which are like tripping stones. And they're about this big, and you'll be walking down the street and you'll see in a sidewalk in front of a house one of these, and it will list the person's name, the family's name, which concentration camp they were sent to, and what day they were murdered. And so you can't not walk down a sidewalk without inhabiting the past at the same time you're inhabiting the present. It's an emotionally wrenching thing because the past is always there and the forensic landscape is always before you. And they do this over and over again with how they do memorials. They struggle over how to do a memorial. What is a memorial for? Why do we do this? This sort of thing. And so when I was over there, I was really taken with the idea, like for instance, there's a square there. And it was where the massive book burning took place, one of the massive book burnings in Berlin. And the memorial to it, which is so beautiful, is there's a hole in the ground. And then you look down the hole, it's a kind of plastic window that you look through. And they've created the memorial. So if you look across the square, you just see the square. If you come up to this, you stumble across it, and it's maybe 10 feet square, something like that. And you look down, and they're just empty library shelves. And that's all. Nothing said, anything like that. And then there's a little quote by Heinrich Heine that says something to the effect that once they've begun to burn books, it won't be long before they begin to burn people. And that's all you needed. That is stunning to me. So to answer your question, so the whole idea of the beginning of the book is trying to imagine this little girl who wouldn't understand what she's seeing. Her parents having brought her to this book burning and trying to understand through the consciousness of a 2 to 3 year old who's having a hard time with any except associative logic anyway. The Germans always held their book burnings at night because they wanted to create this kind of dreamlike aura, this mythological dreamlike aura around these purifications, they call them, of knowledge. And so that's how it started, trying to imagine that. And then it was only, in section 2 that Jackson Pollock comes up. And then in section 3, one of the main, what you call it, thematics of that is aging is a kind of atrocity. that's another thing we don't like to think about too hard. But, you know, there's a certain moment, Thomas Pynchon said this, is that literature becomes serious at the moment it creates an attitude toward death in it. That there's a moment where you begin to understand entropy doesn't happen out there, it happens from the inside out. And at that moment, everything gets serious, which is like an amazingly awesome insight. And so the third part is actually Edie beginning to understand that we're all murdered. It just depends at what point in our life. And that the murder comes from inside at a certain point, as well as from outside. None of you will believe this. And in 30 years, you'll go, Olsen was right. I'm living proof. So anyway, so that's how it all started.
Yeah, I think that's really like helpful. And like, you know, on one hand, like the scant amount of information can be like a little frustrating, but then that gives you like so much like leg room to just like go nuts. And like, you know, like at the end of the day, Edie was a person and you're a person, and you would sort of like go from there and imagine like, you know, thoughts. And like that book burning scene, like there's a dialogue between her parents of, you know, back and forth. I think one was more optimistic about like, this is going to pass over. This was like, I think like the end of like the Weimar Republic. And so like, you know, we all know that it didn't last long. And there was like a line of, I think, an observation from her father, maybe. Perspective sort of like melt a little bit. But you know, of the people who were attending the book burning and the people who were like throwing books in the fire, someone notes that it was like fewer people than they expect, but more people than they would like. I think I'm not quite remembering it, but it's just that unease of like there are a lot of like people just buying into it, and like the rise of populism, and it will never happen here. And of course, like this is very resonant of like the fervor that we're seeing now of like, you know, the attacks on libraries and literature and intellectualism.
Mhm.
And I think like, you know, drawing on this current moment like just makes that history like all the more authentic. And
Yeah, and yeah, we have to talk about Trump. He's so okay. So sorry to use the word, but so so I wrote a couple novels ago called My Red Heaven that actually was all about the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazism, because what was really interesting about Germany was that, you know, in the 1920s up to 1933, when Hitler became chancellor, was one of the most vibrant times and one of the most liberal times in European history. The arts were thriving, the sciences were thriving. You know, Einstein was in Berlin. These incredible art movements, expressionism was exploding, incredible poetry going on, all these kind of drama. You know, Schoenberg was creating incredibly dynamic, experimental sonic landscapes, all of these sorts of stuff. And so you would have thought, living in the middle of that would go on forever. And then all of a sudden, there was this rise of an incredibly powerful figure who was democratically elected. People tend to forget that about Hitler. And then as soon as he gained power, began to undermine those kind of democracies. And also that there was this, what would you call it? This sort of drunken fondness for a strong father figure. I mean, that's basically what it was, who said, I can make order for you. I can create, you know, the trains can run on time, you know, all of these sorts of stuff. And so one of the things I wanted to do, though history is a problem, what isn't the problem is politics and how those things echo over and over and over again. So when I was writing My Red Heaven, Trump was just getting elected. And that's, you know, that's the nightmare that we're trying to deal with. Like, how do you do that? Robert and I were just talking about this, that, you know, there's a really good chance that this election is only going to be won by a couple thousand votes, that you know, Kamala can win the popular vote and Trump still looks like he has the electoral vote in hand. And like, what does that feel like? as that happens to a culture, right? And so that's the underpinning of this novel, like at the deepest structure, is that notion of things beginning to fall apart. And what does that feel like? And you'll always think it doesn't happen here. You'll always think this is something that happens, in those fascist countries. And it's happening all around us. And at least 42%, 42 to 47% of the American population thinks that's a good thing, because he'll give us some kind of order. So he's the king of chaos. So that's not that I have any political views anymore. But I just, so I think sometimes that gets lost when you're writing, but we're all sort of, even as we can't get back to history, we're all products of history, and to become aware of that in a way that isn't preachy, but is very, much where we are trying to think through. One of the things I always ask my students is like, how do we write the contemporary in a way that neither abandons the past nor completely embraces the past? Like, that's our real job. What does that look like your contemporary? And that leads to another way I think of fiction as a kind of space of contemplation of where we are. So even when you write about the past, you're always writing about the present. Whenever you're writing, science fiction, when you claim to be writing about the future, you're never writing about the future. You're writing about a metaphor of the present, right? 1984 came out in 1948. And so it's that mode of, we're always writing about the now. And our now is a terribly disconcerting now.
Yeah, like especially with like the political parallels in the novel, like Hitler isn't called Adolf Hitler. He's referred to as like Adolf, which is almost like affectionate little like, diminutive little name. Yeah. Oh, my Uncle Adolf or whatever. In the same way that like people say, no one says like Donald Trump. They say like Trump, and there's like a cult of personality around that. There's a famous quote of like, only I could fix this, which is like so resonant of like all the strong man tropes, and desperate people look for solutions, and easy ones are easy to follow. So I thought like, that was like very well done, and it's resonant, but also like it didn't feel preachy. There's a issue of like, even if I agree with something, sometimes if it's trying to like push me somewhere, it doesn't work.
Totally with you. Yeah.
And like, I feel like this was really well done. And like, just in terms of chaos generally, like, do you have any like narrative tips or tricks that writers can use to like employ controlled chaos? Because that's what I feel like this novel was. Like there's a lot going on. And the third section, we get like more contemporary issues that are battled with through these like lifetimes. Yeah. But I still felt for the most part like behind the wheel, and like, the road was going somewhere. So like any like narrative techniques of like how to like be experimental, but also like not lose the reader completely.
Yeah, no, I have absolutely no advice whatsoever, because but there's a reason for that. And I think it goes back to that advice to my students about like learning how to write the contemporary, because the contemporary is going to come to each of us in a very different key, in a very different register, in a very different form. And that's the thrill of writing right now. It may sound like we should all sort of give up and go home, but I think rather than that, what we're really being challenged to do is to find new ways to write about a world that has never existed before. And what does that look like? For me, it's extremely hard. My first novel was kind of a magical realist novel, but after that, it was like, that doesn't feel like it's capturing my sense of lived reality. It feels like it's capturing somebody else's sense of reality. So another quick digression, we'll be back. But so how narratives come to us. If a kind of narrative pattern is repeated enough in enough books, we begin to take that as the truth of how narrative patterns should go, right? And so, the well-crafted novel, which just means if you follow a certain set of rules, you come up with a novel that looks like other people's novels, doesn't to me feel like it's capturing my sense of lived experience. It feels like I've given myself over to somebody else's. In certain ways, it's on a macro scale, the equivalent of the cliche. It's letting other people think for your language. This is letting other people think for your form. And it's like all of us are going to have different forms because we're all living in a mad world, but we all sense that mad world very differently and experience that mad world very differently. And so what is that going to look like? And that's the great challenge. And so it's not like I can give an answer, oh, well, you can, right? The obvious answer is write like me. No, the obvious answer is make sure not to write like me, but to find how you write. And I mean that at the deepest level. So one other deep point about this for me is the idea that form is philosophy. We're usually taught that thematics is philosophy, and that's true, right? So a lot of us read novels at the level of character or thematics, and that's where we go to find our philosophy. But there's a deep structure philosophy that often works in dissonance to that, and that's form. And so ironically, at least for me, a lot of novels will talk at thematics or character in radical terms, but formally be incredibly conservative. And that tension drives me crazy. It's like, so you're belying your thematics by putting it in a nice box. And so what happens if rather than that, you say, what is the form that will house my philosophy? Not only what are the thematics that will house it, what are the characters that house it, so and so, but what are the formalistics that will house it? And they're going to be different for everybody. Like, what does that look like? What is the form of my lived reality, not anybody else's? And that's where you find your voice. Like, that's where the real, that's how you can tell a Donald Barthelme story. So Donald Barthelme is not only that it has a backbroke sentence, but it has a backbroke form. And that form you can see a mile away. You know, as you walk into MoMA and you look across the room and you see a Jackson Pollock, you do not need to go up and go, I wonder who painted that. That's a Jackson Pollock. Duh, because of the form. And so to me, that's like super important question that we all have to struggle with. And that's what wakes me up every morning. Sometimes at 4 a.m, but hopefully at a more reasonable time. It's like, so how do you do that? And if you can find that, you can become yourself as a writer.
No, I think that's really interesting. I'm taking a course right now with like craft and how to craft novels. So we're reading like a lot of craft books. And, you know, I think for beginning writers, it's easier to like lean on like a more conventional structure, but like a lot of them do like, while like talking about experimentation, rely on like that familiar structure, which is, you know, very ironic. And that leads me to ask, like, what like are people or novelists who like influence your writing? Like I noted like Derrida in like the third half, so like some philosophers and stuff like that. But like, what would you consider like influences for like how you write, or just like people that you love to read and how they do form?
Yeah, which is such a fun question to answer. So David Foster Wallace talked about how his generation was the first generation to grow up with the TV, and that television really influenced the way he saw the world, right? So a lot of his shticks can be seen as moves that he would have seen in television, right? I think my generation was one of the first generations when we went to college. We had to take theory courses, and I became a little theory addict. I realized that everybody theorizes. Some of us will admit it and some of us won't, but to open your eyes in the morning is to begin to theorize a world. What do I believe the world looks like? How do I believe the world functions? And so on. That's theory, that's philosophy. And so that absolutely captivated me. And so as I teach, one of the things, and this just because it worked for me, I often will throw not only literary texts at my students, but theoretical texts, like heavy duty theoretical, like D.A.A.D or like Cixous or like Derrida, and say like, okay, so what would a fiction look like that grants that this exists in the world rather than sort of skirts around the existence of this, okay? And so one of the people that hit me really, really hard early on was Nietzsche, and then after Nietzsche, Heidegger, and then after Heidegger, Derrida. And a lot of people think of Derrida as a language philosopher. kind of, Derrida in 30 seconds is that Derrida teaches us that meaning always means more than meaning means to mean, that language is always a lot less stable and a lot more riddled with possibility than we would like to believe it is. We would like to think we can control language. In many ways, language controls us. But what's interesting about Derrida is a whole different level. What's interesting to me about Derrida, he collaborated with a woman whose name is Catherine Malibu, who's a philosopher, and they began to write postcards as they traveled back and forth across the world to each other. And one of the things that came out of that through her and his sort of sets of admissions was that actually the deep structure of his philosophy is a philosophy of exile. It's a philosophy of never being at home. A lot of us think of Derrida as a French philosopher. He wasn't. He was actually raised in Algeria, and he was raised a Jew in an Arabic community, but it was a Jewish family that didn't feel itself Jewish, but didn't feel itself Arab. Then he went to Paris and learned a language that wasn't his first language and had to exist in the in-between space of that language in a culture that had colonized a land that he didn't actually feel was his home any more than Paris was his home. And so when you begin to think like in those terms and you enter a sentence by, or a critique of a sentence by Derrida, what you realize is he's over and over again proving that home isn't the fundamental human condition, that the fundamental human condition is homelessness. Okay, so if that's true, how do you write a novel that embodies that idea? Okay, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And Absolute Away, the third section of Absolute Away especially is an answer to that question. What does it feel like to be in exile in our bodies, right? What does it feel like to be in exile in our language? What does it feel like to be in exile in history? So not just place exile, but all the other kinds of exiles you can be. And I wanted to really investigate that in kind of a deep way of so what and that delights me because I like to be in exile in many ways. Exile seems to have negative terms, but it has all sorts of positive terms because you're always reinventing yourself. You're always exploring new terrains, and I wanted to kind of explore those new terrains in a novel.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like your notion of like exile, like I felt a lot of times like there's like exile from like time and like it was very like thin blurry line there, and I was here for it because it's just like we're moving so fast and like so much is happening that it's just such a fun place to explore, and I feel like it hasn't been explored that I've seen, but it seemed like you have some good recommendations for people who like to go in that gray area.
Yeah, and that, sorry, and the second part of your question, yeah, and some of the writers that I love to be in exile, not only in the world, but in the texts that I read. That is to say, I don't like to feel settled. I like texts that are really destabilizing, either intellectually or formally or at the level of sentence. I like to be kind of jazzed up in the text. That makes me feel awake. And so the writers that I respond to most are people like Beckett, are people like, we talked about Barthelme and so on. Or more recently, I have a colleague whose name is Lindsay Drager, and she just came out, she's a wonderful writer. She just came out with a novel called Avian Hourglass. And it's kind of an eco novel. It's kind of a novel about, it's about this woman, we think maybe late 20s, early 30s, and she's in this small town that she can't seem to get out of. And something called the crisis has happened, but she's not really clear what the crisis is. There's a climate crisis, but it's also the crisis of just living the contemporary. And she she always wanted to be a radio astronomer, but she ended up driving a bus on Route 0, and Route 0 is this route that nobody ever gets on the bus. So she just drives in this circle in an empty bus over and over and over again. And it's a beautiful sort of investigation of, again, the contemporary of not being able to get out of this world and having to learn how to navigate this world in your own empty bus going in circles. But you also like surprises in every sentence. I just love the movement of that. And it just got published like a couple of weeks ago. So everybody should go out and read that. And then everybody should go out and read Robert's book. I'm halfway through your new manuscript, as I was saying, The Best People. And Robert does the same thing. Like you can't start a sentence by Robert and know how the ending of that sentence is going to go, or if it is a sentence, because many of your sentences become something other than what we usually think of as sentences, right? And that like totally delights me. So, and that's coming out next year, either March or April. So you should, when it comes out, you should read that too.
Yeah, for sure. No, I wrote down a couple of those titles, especially Avian Hourglass. I'm really interested in like sentence structure to like the detriment of like my poor undergrad students who are like, why are you going to my sentences like that? I'm like, because it's my crack. And like, I think, I don't know, like, when I was reading your book, I love reading things where like I learned that like you're allowed to do this. And especially if it's done well.
Oh, and it's even better if you're like not allowed to do this and you do it well.
True. Yeah. I was just like, you know, it's so different from conventional, but it still works. And it's just such a satisfying feeling.
Totally.
Does anyone have any questions for Lance?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Allie.
Hi, Allie.
Hi. So I was going to ask you about the third section that you just answered my question, which is more about like what was the driving kind of question or thematic thing that you were after. But you talked a little bit about exile. So I was wondering about how you made the choices of it seems like there's different lives in that section. And I was wondering about your process there, like how you decided to explore this life over this life, and if the war had anything to do with that, and where you went there in your head.
Boy, I wish I had a larger answer, but it was one life took me into another life. I wanted no two lives of Edie to be the same. I wanted to make sure that she didn't stay Edie. So sometimes she's a male. Sometimes it's ambiguous about her gender. Sometimes she's young. Sometimes she's really old. Sometimes she exists in Viking history. Sometimes she exists in other histories. And so I wanted really, you know, again, to the reader to feel a kind of exile and to experience that sense of how energizing being in exile can be. Because I think textuality is all about creating spaces of discomfort that are productive, a kind of productive skepticism. And so anyway, so I wish I could answer. I just remember waking up in the morning and going, I think Edie's going to be a young man who is a Viking in 998. Let's see how that works. And did it that way. Yeah. And then I you know, it was like shuffling, right? So I can't account for it. I think it's more intuitive, but it was just like I'd have them all out there. And then it was like, so should this one go here? Does that feel right going there? What will create the most shock in a reader going there? So it was that kind of thing. Intuitive. He said, hopefully. I didn't even see you over there because there's a computer blocking your head. So I'm now going to do this. Okay.
What are your thoughts on minimalism, like literary minimalism?
I mean, I love the minimalists. I don't embrace the philosophy behind minimalism, but just because it's not my perception of stuff, but who are some of the minimalists that you're thinking of?
Like Mary Robeson, Amy Hempel, Raymond Carver.
Yeah, and
Donald Bartholomew's brother, Rick.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I'm trying to think back, probably in the 70s, right? When I first came across some of the early minimalists. And what I loved about them was the sort of shiny, glassy sentences of the minimalists. And also somebody like Raymond Carver, who do a very strange and wonderful thing with the minimalism that he invented. Like when we talk about minimalism, it's as if there's one thing, and of course there's not. They're minimalisms, right? But Raymond Carver's version of that is a kind of disruptive minimalism. So he creates all these gaps in his work, and the reader, is actually forced to fill in those kinds of gaps, and that I found very, very alluring. So I probably absorbed some of the minimalist moves, but I have a more probably not maximalist in the sense of Thomas Pynchon maximalism, but maximalism in terms of like how much stuff can you cram into 275 pages. But so are you a fan of minimalism? Is that something that speaks to you?
Yeah. I think
And
so,
what is it
definitely.
about that you feel connected with?
Well, I definitely asked the question because uh, all the writers you mentioned are like, big, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But it was, I don't know, I guess the way that I originally entered into reading and started enjoying reading was, yeah, reading those writers. I guess because I don't know. I mean, I'm a dyslexic, so the sentences were approachable.
Mm-hmm.
Like yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
the pages made sense to me, and it just wasn't overwhelming.
Also, this is a weird thing, but I love the look of page. A lot of us don't like talk about the look of pages, and minimalists have these beautiful looking pages because there's a lot of white space on them. And so the sentences, a lot of times I'm thinking of people like Carver, float in the white. And so the sentences gain more weight by the float. And I love that expression on the page. So it's hard to read minimalism fast. And it has something to do with I think the white float. Yeah. Yeah. And you had your hand up.
Hi, I'm Rachel.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi. I just wanted to say, first of all, I really appreciate your formist philosophy because I took a lot of philosophy and I always wondered how it could coexist with writing because I mean it is writing. So yeah, I'm really interested in that. I was also really interested in your idea of translation, transference from writing and music and paintings and art, and I'm a painter as well. So I wondered if that comes from your experience, being a painter or a musician, or if that's something that sort of originated from, I guess, just really looking at things and listening to things and finding a way to break that down and then recreate it, I guess.
Yeah, and I don't know why. I think because of institutions, right? So the creative institutions tend to categorize the arts, and that always just struck me as a very weird thing to do. And I think all of us, is it not true that we all love lots of arts at once, right? And so the game is, and this is super energizing to me, is how to not think of the arts as this art or that art or that art, but to think about collaborative modes, right? So for instance, I'm working on a novel right now that has a real, hybrid image function going on in it. And I'm just really, because visuals don't do the same thing as words. So what is the relationship of those things? And how do you bring that out in a richer kind of texture? And I'm sure part of this has to do with being married for decades and decades to an artist. But we began to collaborate early on. So like one of our projects is called "There's No Place Like Time," and it's a video installation that grew out of a novel of mine whose protagonist's name was Alana. And we created a video installation of all of her retrospective of videos. So starting back in the 70s, and we sort of like created videos that looked like they were made in the 70s all the way to the contemporary. So it's a novel you walk through. I set it up in gallery spaces, and then people come thinking they're seeing a real installation of a real artist, but in fact see a real installation of a fictional artist. That's an amazingly interesting space. And it's only about trying to get these arts to talk to each other, right? And I feel like in this day and age, of all day and ages, is there really anything different or any border between anything? I just don't see it. And then I was in a horrible band when I was in high school. I mean, truly, we won't go there, but you know how like when you're playing music, it just opens up different parts of you than words do. And so it does different things. And I got into music very, very early on. And then with the philosophy, right? It's so weird that you go to a philosophy department to learn philosophy, creative writing department to learn creative writing. It's like you say, they're both writing and they're both ways of processing the world. Why would you separate those things? Because they're the same thing, right? And we philosophize in our novels. And as I always say, so I think people think of philosophy as somehow like somehow, what would you say, more objective or something like that. But it's really just spiritual autobiography, as we were just talking about with Derrida. It's not like Derrida wasn't actually writing a kind of spiritual autobiography about his own sense of exile. That's what he was doing. He called it philosophy. He didn't call it philosophy. He called it thinking. Derrida makes this cool distinction between philosophers and thinkers. Philosophers are those that try to develop systems, and thinkers are people who just like gnaw through the idea of contemplation. And so what you believe, and we all know this feeling, what you believe at 6 a.m. isn't what you will believe at 3 p.m. Right? It's because we change all the time. So that like really excites me. As you can tell, I could talk about these things. Right? Yes. Thank you.
If there are no more questions, let's give a final round of applause.
Oh, thank you, everybody. That was awesome. Thank you.
Here, I didn't get a hold of it, unfortunately, my hand lived it.